The story of Pharaoh and Moses is one of the most well-known and popular stories from the Bible. The story has been told and retold countless times and has been adapted to many different mediums. The story begins with Moses, who was born a Hebrew but was raised as an Egyptian by Pharaoh's daughter. As an adult, Moses learns of his true heritage, and after killing an Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew, Moses flees Egypt. He eventually settles in Midian, where he marries Zipporah and has 2 sons. One day, while Moses is tending his flock, he sees a burning bush that is not consumed by the flames. God speaks to Moses from the bush and tells him to return to Egypt to lead the Hebrews out of slavery. Moses is initially hesitant, but with God's help, he eventually persuades Pharaoh to let the Hebrews go. After Pharaoh changes his mind and pursues the Hebrews, Moses parts the Red Sea, allowing the Hebrews to escape while Pharaoh and his army are drowned. The holy story of Pharaoh and Moses is a famous story from the Bible. It tells of how Moses, a Hebrew slave, led the Israelites out of Egypt and into the Promised Land. The story begins with Moses being born into a family of slaves in Egypt. His mother, fearing for his life, hid him in a basket among the reeds of the Nile. Here he was found by Pharaoh's daughter and raised as a prince. As an adult, Moses witnessed an Egyptian guard mistreating a Hebrew slave. He killed the guard and fled into the wilderness. Here he married Zipporah and had 2 sons. Moses eventually returned to Egypt after receiving a message from God. He confronted Pharaoh and demanded that he let the Israelites go. When Pharaoh refused, Moses performed several miracles, including turning a staff into a snake and turning the Nile River to blood. Finally, God sent the 10th and final plague, the death of the firstborn. This finally convinced Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. Moses led them out of Egypt and across the Red Sea, where they were pursued by the Egyptian army. The Israelites were saved when God parted the sea, allowing them to escape while the Egyptians were drowned. Afterward, Moses received the 10 Commandments from God on Mount Sinai. He then led the Israelites through the wilderness for 40 years before finally bringing them to the Promised Land. The story of Pharaoh and Moses is one of the most famous stories in the Bible. It tells the story of how Moses, a man who was born a slave, led the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt. The story begins with the Israelites living in slavery in Egypt. They were forced to work in the fields and in the mines and were treated cruelly by the Egyptians. One day, a man named Moses was born into slavery. Moses was a special child, and he was raised in the palace of the Pharaoh. Moses grew up to be a strong and brave man, and he soon became the leader of the Israelites. Moses led the people out of slavery and across the Red Sea. The Pharaoh and his army chased after them, but they were drowned in the sea. The story of Pharaoh and Moses is a story of hope and freedom. It is a story that teaches us that even the most powerful people can be defeated. The story of Pharaoh and Moses is one of the most well-known stories in the Bible. It is a story of God's power and mercy, and a story of faith and obedience. The story begins with God calling Moses to lead his people out of slavery in Egypt. God tells Moses that he will perform miracles to persuade Pharaoh to let the people go. Moses is initially reluctant, but he obediently follows God's commands. Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh and demand that he let the people go. Pharaoh refuses, and God begins to work miracles. The first miracle is the turning of a staff into a snake. Pharaoh's sorcerers are able to replicate this miracle, but Aaron's snake swallows up all the other snakes. The second miracle is the turning of water into blood. This miracle causes great hardship for the people of Egypt, but Pharaoh still refuses to let the people go. The third miracle is the plague of frogs. This plague is so severe that Pharaoh begs Moses to remove it. Moses agrees, but only if Pharaoh agrees to let the people go. Pharaoh agrees, but once the plague is gone, he changes his mind and refuses to let the people go. The fourth miracle is the plague of gnats. This plague is so uncomfortable and annoying that Pharaoh again begs Moses to remove it. Moses agrees, but once again Pharaoh changes his mind and refuses to let the people go. The fifth miracle is the plague of flies. This plague is so terrifying and repulsive that Pharaoh finally relents and agrees to let the people go. However, he changes his mind yet again and pursues the Israelites as they flee. The sixth miracle is the plague of boils. This plague is so severe that even Pharaoh's officials beg him to let the people go. Pharaoh finally relents, but once again he changes his mind and pursues the Israelites. The seventh miracle is the plague of hail. This plague is so destructive that Pharaoh's own officials convince him to let the people go. Pharaoh finally agrees, but as soon as the hail stops, he once again pursues the Israelites. The eighth miracle is the plague of locusts. This plague is so devastating that Pharaoh has no choice but to let the people go. However, he once again changes his mind and pursues the Israelites. The ninth miracle is the plague of darkness. This plague is so absolute and complete that Pharaoh is finally forced to let the people go. However, he once again changes his mind and pursues the Israelites. The final miracle is the death of the firstborn. This miracle is so horrific and devastating that Pharaoh has no choice but to let the people go. This time, he does not pursue the Israelites, and they are finally free. This story is a powerful reminder of the awesome power of God. It is also a reminder of the importance of obedience. The trials and tribulations that Pharaoh and Moses went through were great. They both had to face many obstacles in order to get to the promised land. For Pharaoh, he had to deal with the plagues that God sent down upon Egypt. This was a huge test of his faith. He had to watch as his people were struck with disease and death. This must have been very difficult for him to handle. As for Moses, he had to deal with the fact that he was not allowed to enter the promised land. This was a huge disappointment for him. He had led the Israelites out of slavery and had led them through the wilderness for 40 years. But in the end, he was not able to go with them into the promised land. This must have been a very difficult thing for him to deal with. The firstborn son of each family in Egypt was to be killed by Pharaoh's soldiers. To Moses, this was an order from God to kill all the firstborn sons in Egypt. By killing the firstborn sons, Moses would be able to show the people of Egypt the power of God. When the people of Egypt saw the dead bodies of their firstborn sons, they would be terrified and would finally free the Israelites from slavery. Moses went to Pharaoh and demanded that he let the Israelites go. Pharaoh refused and instead increased the Israelites' workload. The Israelites began to suffer and cry out to God for help. God responded by sending plagues upon the Egyptians. The plagues included turning the Nile River to blood, covering Egypt in frogs, filling the land with snakes, striking the Egyptians with disease, and sending swarms of locusts to eat all the crops. After each plague, Pharaoh promised to let the Israelites go, but he always went back on his word. Finally, God sent the 10th and final plague, the death of the firstborn sons. This time, Pharaoh's own son was killed. Pharaoh was so grief-stricken that he finally agreed to let the Israelites go. The Israelites were instructed by God to put lamb's blood on their doorposts so that the angel of death would pass over their homes. The next morning, the Israelites left Egypt in haste. As they were leaving, the Egyptian army pursued them. God responded by parting the Red Sea, allowing the Israelites to cross safely to the other side. The Egyptian army attempted to follow, but the sea came crashing down on them, drowning them all. The Israelites were finally free from slavery. This event is known as the Exodus. It is one of the most important events in Jewish history. The story of Pharaoh and Moses is a story with a moral. The moral of the story is that God is always with us, no matter what we go through in life. Even when we are at our lowest, God is still there with us, supporting us. This story shows us that no matter how bad things may seem, God is always with us and will help us through anything. The story of Pharaoh and Moses is a story of two men who were once friends, but who ended up as enemies. It is a story of ultimate betrayal, as Moses betrayed Pharaoh by leading the Israelites out of slavery. And it is a story of God's power and mercy, as he protected Moses and the Israelites from Pharaoh's wrath. In the end, Pharaoh and Moses both paid the price for their choices. Pharaoh lost his kingdom and his life, while Moses was forced to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. But through it all, God was faithful to his promises. He protected his people, and he brought them into the promised land. This story is a reminder that God is always faithful. He keeps his promises even when we don't deserve it. And his love and mercy are always available to us, no matter how far we stray from him. Moses was a great prophet of God who led the Israelites out of Egypt. Pharaoh was a powerful ruler who believed that he was a god. The two men had a dramatic confrontation that led to the Exodus. The story of these two men is a powerful story of faith and God's power.